What's up guys, it's John from BleepinJeep, back again with the XJ TDI project. I've got a 1.9 liter Volkswagen ALH TDI going into my 2001 XJ. Today I'm going to be pulling out the engine that's in there right now for mock-up and talking about the adapter and the clutch and all of the components that are going into getting that engine kind of bolted up to the Jeep transmission and some of the parts that I'm using there. So let's dive into it, but first go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel so that you get all the updates and you can see what other cool stuff's going on with BleepinJeep. As you can see, the engine is in place. The mounts are in and tacked together. I just finished that up yesterday. And the TD conversions adapter is on there, just roughed in. There's no flywheel on there or anything right now. With everything tacked together, I was able to check the clearance of the track bar to the oil pan and the hood over top of the intake. I was concerned about that because a lot of people have intake clearance issues with TDI swaps. So right here we're looking at the stock VNT15 turbo. And it may not be super obvious from this angle, but there is plenty of clearance around the actuator where the vacuum hose would connect there. I've got the EGR blocked off already, had that way on the Jetta, as well as what's called a race pipe, an EGR delete tube on the intake here. For the 4L, the engine mount actually is part of the track bar mount on the driver's side. So what I had to do was actually to kind of fabricate that bracket together so that it still gives the strength for the track bar that's needed, but it's obviously giving clearance for the alternator. The mark that's on there right now is just to give a little extra clearance for your alternator. At this point, my next steps are going to be to pull the engine back out, finish trimming up this track bar mount, burn in the engine mounts, put the flywheel on, get the whole transmission adapter back together, and we'll show you all that. So this is just one part of the TD conversions adapter. There's two parts to the actual adapter between the engine and bell housing, and this is the Volkswagen side of it. So obviously this bolts in to the block, and there's also a crank adapter. So this is a custom made piece that they sell you with their kit, and it is made out of steel, comes with a pilot bearing already pressed into it. So all this is really adapting to is from the Volkswagen bell housing to their other piece of the adapter, and it's setting the space needed for that crank adapter in there as well. So then this is the other half of the adapter, and the holes around the very outside perimeter are what mate to the Jeep transmission. In my case, I'm using the AX15. The other set of holes that is in here is there's 6 sets of 3 holes all the way around closer to the center. Those are clocking positions. So the adapter here gives you the option of 3 different clocking positions. So keeping your transmission flat where it should be allows you to set the engine at 3 different degrees of tilt, passenger side or driver side, or basically centered. And the way that affects things is, you know, as I said, the transmission stays flat, the engine tilts, but as this rotates, this hole to the right is where the starter comes through, and as that clocks one way or the other, it brings the starter either closer to the turbo or further away from the turbo. But the starter motor, which also comes in the kit, is aligned with it's out of the way of the turbo on the middle hole or this hole. If it's on this hole, in my experience here with the VNT 15 turbo that was stock on my engine, there's a clearance issue with the starter and the bottom bolt of the exhaust flange on the turbo. I opted to run in the center hole. I tested, fitted everything, and it works. So I'm gonna stick with that. Some people like it to be tilted the other way so that it's leaning more towards the passenger side of the vehicle, and that would give you a little bit more clearance on the steering side of things. I'm pretty happy with where things ended up for mine. Just to show you what this transmission side of the adapter looks like over here. And now these bolts that come through, so these would be coming through from this side into the adapter, the other half of the adapter. The heads of those bolts end up quite close to the flywheel inside of here. So it is definitely recommended to run the lock washers on that, as well as some red Loctite, because if these were to back out, be some major issues from that. So we don't want that happening. Included with the TD conversions kit is this nice PowerMaster high torque starter. And this bolts into the housing here like so. Now, that's obviously not the same spot where the 4.0 starter was. It can't be that low because of the casting of the block. There's a big flange that comes out. So on the AX15 here, can't use the stock starter position there. So I did have to grind the bell housing out here a little bit. Yeah, I just used a burr bit on a drill. It actually did come through the bell housing a little bit on the back side. I went ahead and JB welded that up. So right now I'm installing the flywheel bolts into the crank adapter using the ARP assembly lube that comes with the ARP bolts that I bought. And the instructions are to just apply this to the head of the bolt like so, and then to use some blue Loctite 242 thread locker. Installing our last bolt here, and then we torque them all down to 75 foot-pounds. It's important to note that 75 foot-pounds is lower than the standard Jeep torque or these ARP bolts. The instructions said 100 foot-pounds, and the reason for that is that this crank adapter is not quite hardened to the same exact spec as a Jeep crank. So it's not going to run any problems with our setup here, unless we were to crank it to 100 foot-pounds, then we could strip some threads. So important, make it 75. We've got the ARP lube on each bolt, and we've got blue Loctite, and you got 20 minutes to set all those before the Loctite sets. Now, of course, we want to go in an alternating pattern here. I like to just check them in sequence then. All right, our flywheel is installed. It's good practice once you have properly torqued a bolt to just indicate it with some marker paint. It's always a good idea to clean this surface here too, because this is coated with an anti-rust. You can see if you look closely that my ring gear has a little bit of surface rust on it, and that's only because the temperature here climbed like 20 degrees in one day. You got all this humidity, and so all these heavy metal objects that didn't change temperature quickly got a lot of condensation. But the rest of it didn't rust because this is coated with a anti-rust coating, and that can cause hot spots on the clutch surface here when this is put together, or when this is put in use. So want to make sure we give that a good cleaning. We don't want to forget about our pressure plate side. And for that same exact process for the same reason, so we'll go ahead and clean this with some brake cleaner as well. Of course, there is a right way and a wrong way to install your clutch disc, so make sure that's going the right way. With the spring side facing out, there's sort of a recessed side and a side that protrudes. Once we get all the bolts in there, we want to tighten those down equally, not torque them down, tighten them down, because as you tighten each one of these down, it compresses the pressure plate. So it's important to give kind of a half turn to each as you go around so that it's compressing that all at an equal rate. So now that we're torquing these down, and the spec for this is 38 foot-pounds, we want to go in a crisscross alternating pattern. And these are all snug, so really we just need to make sure that they're good. We'll go straight down. Back up. Cross. In the transmission side of things here, we have a fresh throwout bearing, comes with the clutch kit, and everything else is just your standard stock 4.0 stuff. Nothing really special there. Just need to make sure that our pilot tip of the transmission input shaft is clean and has some grease on it so that it can slide into the new bearing inside there. Use these bolts to draw it in the rest of the way. I know at this point that the pilot is all together there. So what I'm going to do right now is to check for starter engagement and making sure that the pinion gear from the starter engages with the ring gear of the flywheel nice and smooth and will bump the engine. So I don't want to crank the engine because there's so much disconnected here, but I do want to just make sure that this is going to engage positively and no grinding, no bottoming out, and just should sound like a regular bump of the starter without any kind of nasty. So let's give that a go and see what we hear. Contact. Always good to double check things as you go, and that sounds really good to me. Well, that's it for this time. Next time I'll jump into making the engine mounts as well as fabricating the clutch and brake pedal. I had to use one from an older XJ as the 97 and newer ones are pretty scarce, but not a whole lot of modification to that. It looks a little bit daunting at first, but it's really not too bad. So I'll show you that. I'll show you the accelerator pedal bracket that I made to mount the drive-by-wire accelerator. And we'll jump into the donor car a little bit before I scrap that to show you where to look for the main parts that you need to pull from there. If you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe, hit like so you get some updates. And if you can, support us on Patreon. We really appreciate that. See you next time.